This is StoryBeat, Storytellers on Storytelling, an exploration into how master storytellers and artists develop and build brilliant stories and works of art that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators of all kinds find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University in the heart of downtown Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a rating or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. My guest today, Susan L. Schulman, has been a theatrical press agent for over 40 years, handling Broadway, off-Broadway, dance, film, special events, TV, books, and individual personalities, including yours truly. Susan helped me to introduce my book, Beating Broadway to the World. Susan has heralded such memorable projects as Lauren Bacall in Applause, Jim Dale in Scapino, George C. Scott in both Death of a Salesman and Sly Fox, Bob Fosse's Dancin, Death in the Maiden with Glenn Close, Richard Dryefuss, and Gene Hackman, and A Streetcar Named Desire with Alec, Baldwin, and Jessica Lange. Additionally, Susan has repped the Dance Theater of Harlem, the Feld Ballet, the Joffrey Ballet, Circle in the Square, the Phoenix Theater, and the Manhattan Theater Club. She also worked on a legendary production of The Merchant, an adaptation of Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice that is notoriously known as the production that killed Zero Mostel. Her revised memoir, Backstage Pass to Broadway, has recently been published and is available on Amazon.com, at www.backstagepasstobroadway.com, and at other fine booksellers. If you're a lover of theater and theater history, as I am, I urge you to check it out for the many memorable stories Susan has to tell. Perhaps, if we're lucky, we'll get to hear a few of those today. Susan, I'm so happy that you've joined me on StoryBeat today. Welcome.
Thank you, Steve. I'm so honored to join the list of people that you've chatted with on StoryBeat, including many of my clients.
Yes, indeed. We've had a few.
You've talked with, or you're going to talk with Frank Ferlizzo, I know.
Yeah.
All sorts of cool people.
And Austin Pendleton. Yeah, Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about your history, just to get us going on this. How did you get into this crazy thing that we all love and call show business? How did you wind up as a theatrical press agent?
Well, I grew up in New York, and I was a theater kid. I hung out at stage doors. I went to see shows. My parents loved Broadway, and they took me to my first show at 5, which was Flahooley. Big flop, but it was famous because it had life-size Bill Baird marionettes, and also an unknown singer named Barbara Cook making her Broadway debut.
The great Barbara Cook.
I have to admit, I remember the puppets, but nevertheless, that was my first show. So I grew up around the theater, not knowing anybody in the theater. Certainly, nobody in my family had any connection with the theater or show business. My mother was a psychologist, and my father was a businessman. But I loved the theater, but I had no idea of how I could ever possibly get my foot in the door. As I said, I didn't know anybody. I knew, even though I acted in college and high school and community theater, I knew I wasn't good enough or tough enough.
What told you that?
Sorry?
What informed you to yourself that you weren't good enough? What told you that?
I think partly I just saw other people around me, even in community theater and college, that were more talented.
Okay.
I was okay. You know, I was a good sort of workman-like actor, singer, dancer type person, but I knew I wasn't the star, and I also didn't have the confidence. So I think it was a lot of things. But I just instinctively knew that if I ever had a place in the theater, it wouldn't be on stage. So I really didn't have any idea how to get in. And it happened that my very first job out of college was at Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, Inc., which was the parent organization for Lincoln Center, which had just started to be active in New York. And I was a lackey. I didn't have any skills or anything. I couldn't type or anything useful. So I was a lackey. And I kind of worked my way up. And at the end of a year and a half, Lincoln Center had a cutback but they liked me, and they felt guilty that they had to get rid of me. And so they made some calls for me, and I wound up getting a job in a Broadway press office that was connected with Lincoln Center, and that was my foot in the door.
I see, and
because I had the skills. I could write, and I kind of instinctively had that press agent gene. I discovered I had always been the one that went out and beat the bushes.
And you knew it was going to keep you somewhere in the arts and in theater.
Yeah, and I didn't really understand that the press agents actually have a creative input into how a show is not just created, but how a show is perceived. And when I began, I didn't really know that. But as I grew up in the theater and began to be, have more input into shows and that I was working on, I realized that I really did have input into some artistic choices and how a show was perceived, which is very important.
Well, I think it's interesting. I think a lot of people do not think of producers and people that are sort of around the show but not in the show. People don't think of them as being one of the creatives, but certainly what you do is very creative.
Well, and if it's a good producer, they're pretty creative too, because they're the ones with the vision to begin the project in the first place. But yes, there are a lot of people that have creative input. I mean, the advertising agencies, the marketing people, the press agents, all the people responsible for, getting the word out, have a lot to say about how other people will begin to perceive a production.
So can you relate an example of where you had to use a lot of creativity to do something for a show?
Well, I'll give you one example. There was a wonderful, I'm sure your audience knows who Bob Fosse was. Bob Fosse was this brilliant,
I would think so.
Originally he was a dancer and film and just a brilliant dancer, and then a choreographer. And over the course of his career, he became a director choreographer. So he was really the creator of his projects. They weren't handed to him. He was the impetus for most of them. And he took all of his shows to Boston before it came to New York, because he believed that at the time the two major theater critics in Boston, he valued their opinion. And he would see what they thought of one of his productions at the beginning of the run in Boston, and then he would make changes, and he would invite them back. He listened to them. He didn't always agree with them, but he listened to what they had to say because he thought they were smart, and they were smart. And then he would invite them to come back and see the production later on in the run to get a second opinion. So he did listen to people. So Dancin, which was almost a vaudeville of a bunch of dance numbers, as he said, that he wanted to put on stage before he was too old. They were all different styles. There was tap and jazz, and it was just a potpourri of different Bob Fosse numbers with no thread, no storyline, no book. It was just a bunch of dance numbers. And the show opened in Boston, and we thought we had gotten that message out there. We thought we had communicated the fact that it was not a book musical. There was no thread. There was no storyline. It was just dance numbers created by this genius, Bob Fosse. And the show opened in Boston, and everybody hated it. And the critics said, there's no book, there's no story, there's no thread. Well, there wasn't ever supposed to be, but somehow we hadn't communicated that well. We hadn't represented the show as what it really was. And so, as always, he tinkered with it in Boston, and he made some changes, but nothing major. But before the show came into New York, I set Fosse up with a Sunday Times feature in which I said to him, listen, you have to talk about how there's no book and there's no thread and there's no storyline, because people up until now have seen you work on book musicals like Chicago and Sweet Charity, and they're expecting a book musical from you.
Of course.
And so Bob Fosse, who was a very smart fellow, talked endlessly in this Sunday Times Arts and Leisure piece about how Dancin had no book and no storyline and no thread. It was just a bunch of dance numbers. And, of course, theater critics read the Sunday Times as well as the rest of us.
Yes, of course.
And so the show opened, probably 95% the same show that had been presented in Boston. And the critics raved about it. And they said, it's fabulous. There's no book. There's no thread. There's no storyline. Because this time, we had created the right expectations.
So all you had to do was get it out into the public so that it was not thought of as something other than what it is.
Yeah, and we didn't do it right in Boston. But between the Sunday Times piece and other efforts of what we were trying to do, that piece of information got through to people, and particularly to the critics. And so this time, they went in expecting a bunch of dance numbers without a thread and a book and a story.
You know, I've
this
long...
time their expectations were met.
Yeah, absolutely. I've long felt that there is a very big difference when someone goes to a cabaret or a theater or wherever they're going, and somebody says, and now for the comedy stylings of, and you're instantly set up to be told jokes and laugh, as opposed to somebody coming out, you don't know what they're about, and they try to tell jokes, and it takes a while for the audience to figure it out. So,
you know, very often I'll be asked to handle something that has played an engagement prior to New York, that maybe it's been developed in different theater companies across the country, or maybe it's toured or something.
Right.
And so the producer has reviews, and they always want you to, the press agent, to use quotes from those reviews in your invitation to the critics or in your announcement release. And my response, and, you know, it's always fabulous, wonderful, you know, greatest show ever, you know, and the superlatives go on. And I always say, if I were a critic and I received an invitation to a show or a press release about a new show, and it tells me how fabulous and wonderful and glorious it is, my response could very easily be, oh yeah? Show me.
Yeah.
Which is maybe not a good approach.
So what's a better approach?
Don't include that information. Let them discover it for themselves, just like you're saying with a comic that you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Let them discover it. Don't tell them it's going to be that it's fabulous and that you're going to love it.
You tell them, you sort of lay out for the reader what the show's about, but not
and that it has been very well received, maybe. But I would fight to the death about including quotes from a previous production, or it's like daring a critic to, you know, show them. Not a good idea.
I can understand that. That's probably right. So going way back when, what were your earliest influences and inspirations?
Oh, wow. Well, the biggest one was Mary Martin, who was my idol when I was growing up, and then eventually I got to know her a little bit and started as a kind of fan, just a fan, and then over the years she kind of was very kind to me as a young woman, and she was just a very kind person, and I later found out she did this with many people. I corresponded with her until she died. I mean, you know, and later, as I say, I found out I met somebody, in fact, the woman who edited my book, Fran Weil. I was in her house in Boston one day, and on the wall she had a picture of a framed letter from Mary Martin, and I looked at it and I said, oh my God, and she said, what? I said, I have letters from her on that same stationery. And, you know, she had also been corresponding with her as a fan over the years. And then she eventually became a journalist and interviewed her professionally, just as I became a press agent. And I didn't actually work with her professionally, but she knew me as a press agent and as a professional in the theater eventually. Okay, so
she had an influence on you in what way? What was about her that influenced you to make you the professional you became?
I'm not sure she influenced it, although I think part of her influence was because she was so kind to me and to other people, and was very warm and friendly and accessible. And she was, you know, the queen of Broadway. I mean, she was the biggest star going. I mean, you know, she and Ethel Merman were it when I was growing up.
For sure.
And you know, they didn't get any more famous than that in terms of being theater artists. But I think that I also thought that everybody in the theater was going to be like that. Imagine my surprise.
And they're not? Oh, my goodness.
No, go figure.
we may talk about one of those antithetical people here in a minute.
Okay. I can't imagine who you're talking about.
I have a feeling you do know.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you were starting out, your training was by doing it. You didn't go to school to be a press agent, right?
No, I didn't. My bachelor's was from NYU, but I had a theater and English double major, and then eventually I got a master's degree in theater from Columbia. But I always say I'm the only person who has a master's degree that has never earned them 1 red cent, because I didn't. I mean, I have taught at the college level, but not for many years after that. But no, I didn't I didn't take PR courses, if that's what you mean. No.
And so you learned in the School of Hard Knocks. You just did it.
Yeah. I mean, I got jobs and I learned, and I was the little kid in the office, and I really cared, and I loved what I was doing. I was thrilled to be able to hang around during rehearsals or backstage. I just thought it was, I kind of couldn't believe that I was somebody that was part of it. Years later, I worked for a very famous, very well-respected press agent named Merle DeBusky, and on matinee days, we would, as we used to call it, cover the shows. We would go to, before the matinees, we would go and sort of check in at all the different shows that he was handling, and we'd go in and out of the stage doors. And at one point, he looked at me and he was teasing me, and he said, "You just love it, don't you?" And I looked at him and I said, "Don't you ever make fun of that?" Growing up, I couldn't imagine that I could ever walk into a stage door of a Broadway theater and have somebody say, "Hello, Susan." So don't you mock me.
That certainly is a major mark of success,
Well, it was, and it was also completely inconceivable to me growing up. So, the fact that he didn't mean it in a mean way, but he could see how much I loved it, and I did, and I still do.
Well, it wouldn't be much fun if you didn't, would it?
No, and people always say, you shouldn't go into the theater unless you can't stand not to go into the theater, because you can make a lot more money in other places. So you better love it.
I agree. I mean, the theater is a place for passionate people, and that's it. And if you don't have the stomach or the heart or the patience or the determination to be in it, you better forget it, because you're going to have your heart ripped out.
I mean, I've come across people in the theater, and I think, you don't love it. Why are you doing this? You could be working for the phone company and making so much more money.
Yeah, absolutely.
And have so much more security and everything. I've worked with press agents, and I used to think, why are you doing this? You don't seem to be getting any joy from this.
It makes no sense to me when somebody's in that position.
Most people aren't most people in the theater are not like that. Most people in the theater really do love it.
Oh, most people, they wouldn't be in the theater if they didn't. Most of them, because they know that otherwise they're going to be broke.
Yeah, and or the fact that there's no security. In most positions. I mean, there are unions, and obviously the unions protect us to some degree, but with a press agent, for instance, when I was an associate, which meant that I worked for a senior press agent who was the one that actually got the accounts and got the shows, if a show closed, you were out of a job. And it wasn't personal, that's just the way it was.
Yeah.
And so you were out of a job along with, several hundred other people. And then if you were lucky, you'd get a job in another press office with another show, and hopefully that would run and you would, have a job. But I once was interviewed for a non-theater job, and they saw that I had changed jobs fairly frequently. And they said, "Why is that? What happened?" And I said, "Show closed."
Yeah. Well, the
show closed.
the Phantom of the Operas and the Wickeds and those shows are few and far between.
That's right. And if you were lucky, you'd work for a press agent that had a lot of shows. So if one closed, generally they'd keep you on until the next one came, or you'd change to another show and hold a different contract or something. So it was the smaller offices where if a show closed, you were out of luck.
Right. So let's talk about your process. When you're brought into a project, no matter what the project is, whether it's just a personal project for some person or whether it's a big show or whatever it is, what is the first thing you typically do?
Well, it depends. Say it's a show. Let's take a show as an example. The first thing I want to do is read the play or the musical, or read it. The second thing I want to do is sit down with the producers and find out what they see. What is their vision? Where is this going? What is their plan? Who is going to be in it? Who's directing it? I want to know as much about it as possible. Sometimes just reading it doesn't give you the flavor of what it's going to be. Sometimes it's it's a completely different treatment. It could be a classic play, but it could be that it's going to be staged as if it's, on the moon or something. You don't know. So you have to find out as much as you can. And because then you have to look at it and see what it is that you, the press agent, has to sell. And until I can look at it and begin to formulate a plan, I don't really know whether I can do a good job or not. And I am notorious for saying I can't. And that's because sometimes people have very unrealistic expectations.
I see.
Let me repeat that. Sometimes people have very unrealistic expectations.
And you can name names or not. It's up to you. But can you give us an example of someone who had a completely unrealistic expectation?
Well, I don't think that anybody has ever come to me with an off-Broadway show or an off-Broadway show and has not said the words, "Can you guarantee that the New York Times will cover this?" I don't think I've ever not heard that phrase. And my answer is, no, I cannot guarantee that the New York Times will cover this. And if you find a press agent that does guarantee it, they're not telling you the truth.
You need to run for the hills.
Well, that's, or I say to them, then I think you should hire that person, because the reality is nobody can guarantee anything.
Sure. And
as a press agent, all we can do is go out and put the best possible, I don't want to say spin, but the best, present our projects in the best possible light, in the most interesting light, in the most appealing light, and then it's up to them whether they want to come or not. I don't control the New York Times, nor does any press agent.
Right. Of course you don't.
And if any press agent says they do, they're full of it. It doesn't work that way. If only it did.
When you start to work with people, can you tell pretty early on whether the project has a shot at succeeding? Sometimes,
not always. Sometimes you can. Although, people look at shows that come in and they think, God, how, this is terrible. How did this happen? And the truth is, once you're in the middle of it, you lose a little bit of perspective. I mean, I was once working on a show that was a Broadway musical that was out of town pre-Broadway. This is in the days when things went out of town pre-Broadway. And it was kind of a disaster. Sets were falling down and people were bumping into each other, and it just was a mess. And I actually remember sitting in a production meeting where somebody said, if that costume had pockets, it would all come together. Okay.
That show was in trouble.
Meanwhile, like it was a catastrophe. But the vision had shrunk to something as specific as pockets.
I believe that might be called grasping at straws.
Kind of, yeah. I was in another meeting like that where somebody said, if that costume were yellow, it would all come together. And yes. I remember thinking in my very young way, what are they, nuts? That's not going to fix it.
So now you've come into a show and you've sat down, you've had these conversations, you've read all the material, they've told you their vision. What is your next step?
Well, if I think it's realistic and doable, I will then start to make a plan. And if you have a long lead time and it's a big show, you begin working months ahead with, for instance, long lead time magazines, and you'll pitch, the magazines that cover entertainment and specifically theater. You might go after hooks if there's a particular subject matter that the play is about. You might go after specific publications or journalists that cover that particular. For example, say, I'm just plucking this out of the air, say it's a play that has to do with AIDS. You would certainly look to some of the organizations that focus on AIDS and see if perhaps there was an expert in the field that might want to become involved in some way, might want to read the play, or if it's later on come to a rehearsal, and perhaps maybe write something, maybe do some on-camera or radio or television appearances on behalf of the project in conjunction maybe with the author or the star or whoever. So you look for the various angles of a project. Maybe the actors are the hook. Maybe they're the saleable commodities. They're well known. maybe it's the director. It's pretty obvious early on, what the hooks are. And you start with that. You go for the you try to target an audience, whoever you think your core audience is, and then you broaden it from there.
And so, is there some technique to determining who your core audience is?
No, I think it becomes pretty obvious. I mean, with most shows, you begin with people that have interest in the theater. So you're going after outlets like Playbill and all of the online theater websites would be a place to start, for example. You'd look to do features in them. But then also there are people that go to the theater that don't necessarily read those publications or online. So you have to go bigger than that. So then you're looking at what your other hooks are. Is it the actors? Is it the director? Is it the producer? Is it the who is it that's going to generate interest?
And so,
or is it the subject matter?
You don't do any kind of demographic work or anything like that, do you?
No, but people do. The advertising agency will often do surveys and things, do questionnaires.
Do they share it with you?
Yes, absolutely.
Well,
yes.
I see. Okay, so
I mean, the marketing people and the PR people and the advertising people all work very closely together with the producers.
Right.
So yes, all of that information would absolutely be shared and utilized as appropriate. Sure.
All right. So let's look at some other particular, which is you've done both plays and musicals. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Is there a difference in promoting either or agenting either?
No, I think you're always starting with what have I got to sell and who's the audience for it.
Got it. And is there any difference between doing a show and publicizing a book or a personality?
No, I think it's the same thing. It's what have I got to sell and who might be interested.
Got it.
I mean, for instance, with your book, it was pretty obvious who would be interested.
Sure.
I mean, we knew that people that were interested in writing were interested in Broadway, interested in musicals, and then your second book interested in screenwriting. So we started with that, and then we broadened it out, and we discovered that there was a much broader audience for your writing.
We knew at the very beginning we could eliminate worrying about mechanical engineers.
Yeah, we knocked them off. We took them off the list.
You've also worked in TV, and you were in L.A. for a while, correct?
No, I was always based in New York, although I did go back and forth a bit.
I see.
But
and
I worked at A&E Arts and Entertainment, and then oh dear, I forgot. USA Network first, and then Arts and Entertainment, and then I was with CBS also.
And did you? Is there a difference between doing that and working on Broadway?
Yeah, I hated it.
Why?
That was a start. Well, for one thing, when you're working in television, you're basically promoting a product, and they actually call it a product. So you have very little interaction when a TV series or a miniseries or a special is being created. There is a press agent on site, on location, and that person does provide some direct contact with the production. But overall, it's a thing. It's a product. And so it's, we could be selling shoes. It's very cut and dried, and not particularly interesting. Very television is very bureaucratic because of the layers of management and all of that. And the perfect example was when I was at CBS. We had I was in charge. I was the director of press information for all the miniseries at CBS.
Right.
Sounds very important. And one of the miniseries was based on Arthur Schlesinger's book about the Kennedys. And Mr. Schlesinger was around and was very involved. And at one point I said to him, would you be interested in writing an op-ed piece, a what if? Oh, I know. The miniseries was based on his book about Robert Kennedy. It was called Robert Kennedy and His Times. I just remember the title. And when I was talking to Mr. Schlesinger and trying to come up with some ideas, I said, would you be interested in writing an op-ed piece for the New York Times, maybe a what-if piece? What do you think it would be like if Robert Kennedy had lived? And he said, absolutely. And he said, and I would be happy to pitch it because I write for the Times all the time. Well, I thought, well, this was fabulous. So I mentioned this to my boss at CBS, who was the overall head of publicity at CBS. And he said, well, let me check on that. And I'll get back to you. And that proposal of Arthur Schlesinger writing an op-ed piece for the New York Times, which pretty much seemed like a no-brainer to me and to everybody else who heard about it, went up and up and up the channels. And about a week after the miniseries aired, they got back to me and said, yes, go ahead.
And so in other words, it took a while to get through the system.
And after the show had aired.
Oh, and after the show had aired.
Yes,
Well, that's a major
after
problem.
After the show had aired.
I mean, it's kind of interesting if you are continuing to sell it somehow.
Not to me.
If it were
at that time, no, that was it. That was the big show.
Was that in the era prior to DVDs and VHSs?
It was the mid '80s, so probably, yeah.
Yeah. So in other words,
they didn't. That part didn't matter.
Right.
They were only interested in promoting the miniseries airing on CBS.
Yeah, that is the problem with big bureaucracies, and you really don't have that sort of thing on Broadway, do you?
Well, I think there's fewer levels
Disney.
of approvals anyway. But this was a perfect example of the bureaucracy getting in the way, because everybody that I spoke to on the practical level said, "Oh yeah, that'd be great," and it was just so silly because, as I say, they got back to me a week after the miniseries aired.
Sure. It occurs to me that really, I mean, you do have corporate entities obviously on Broadway, but it's really the big kahuna is Disney in terms of true corporate bureaucracy, I would assume.
And from what I understand, they exercise it.
I'm sure they do.
Yeah.
And there's a reason why they make a lot of money.
And they make a lot of money, and they do it really, really well. But from what I've heard, they are very hands-on, micromanaging things and very specific about what you can and cannot do.
Of course. Well, that they're not just protecting a specific property; they're protecting an entire empire.
Yes, and they're very smart. They know what they're doing. So you can't, you can argue with it, but I mean, you can see at least they bring some expertise to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing, from my own personal experience, because I've worked for Disney a number of times, and the other thing that Disney has that some companies have, but they really have in abundance, is anytime they have a problem and they choose to solve the problem, they simply throw money at it. Mm-hmm. And not everybody has that kind of power or resource.
No, there's the deep pockets are there.
Yes.
There's no question about it. But I mean, the good thing is the deep pockets also show up on stage.
Absolutely.
With a Disney production. So, Lion King is brilliant, but you also they have maintained it wonderfully.
And they're not afraid to spend money to make money.
No, they do understand that.
Yes.
But I have heard stories about micromanaging and what they. I've heard it from journalists where they'll pitch a story. They'll say, "What about? I'd like to interview so and so on this and this," and they say, "No, but you could do this."
Right. Yeah. that makes sense. So how
and it's kind of their way or no way, and they can do that,
Well, it is their way or no way. That's for
sure. They are the elephant in the room, so they can do what they want, but they do it very well. If the shows were terrible or that would be one thing, but they're not. They're wonderful.
Exactly. How
and now we have many, many little girls running around Broadway in princess outfits.
Yes, you do.
I mean, they're just twinkling all over the place. Yesterday, about 5 o'clock, I was walking down 44th Street, and there were about 5 little girls in princess outfits. They'd obviously just seen Frozen, and they were just as happy as clams.
Oh, boy.
It was so cute.
Oh, boy.
Yep.
Another long-running show for Disney, for sure.
I would think,
I would think, too.
But it's good. You know what I mean? That's the thing, is it's not just, they didn't just, churn it out. They reinvestigated the story of the film. They rewrote it. They added more music. They added more characters. They really I sound like I work for Disney. I don't, but they really reinvented it.
You can send them a bill later.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Somehow, I think it's going to get lost in the mail.
Somehow.
I'm just guessing. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they're not afraid also of developing something for a different medium.
Yeah, well, they know how to do it.
Right. Yeah.
But I mean, when I think, wasn't the first one Lion King? I think it was.
Beauty and the Beast.
Oh, you're right. Was that first? Yeah, I guess it was first.
Oh, yes, Beauty and the Beast, way before
But,
Lion King.
Beauty and the Beast did very well, and it was very successful, and I'm sure it's still running all over the world. But Lion King was the one that just, everybody was gobsmacked.
Yeah, that's correct.
Because it was so extraordinarily, wonderful.
And it makes a big difference when they have a bit of a machine and are able to use resources to help them.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of producers come in with a budget and they can't exceed it, and then they have a problem.
Yeah, and then they had somebody like Julie Taymor, who is brilliant and a creative genius, but also doesn't really care if it's going to cost $1 zillion.
Yeah, exactly.
Because she says, "This is my vision. You hired me for my vision. This is what I'm doing."
And I would assume the same would apply for those working in the press shop. They would have sort of a pretty heavy budget that they could work with to help push the show along.
I would guess. I mean, I don't know, but they certainly have done a very good job.
Oh, yeah, and our friend Frank Verlizzo. That's his logo.
His logo.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Looking forward to talking to him soon. So, how frequently have you in your career been you were handling multiple projects at the same time?
Oh, almost always.
And so what do you do from a day-to-day work thing? How do you juggle multiple projects at one time? Do you have a technique or tricks, or what do you do?
I don't. I mean, I don't have a... I just work 24/7, I
just
think.
do it.
I mean, also, it helps to have associates that are smart and helpful and creative and, right there. But, I mean, this is a business that's 24/7. It doesn't go away. And now with the Internet, it really doesn't ever go away. You're on call all the time.
Mm-hmm. Do people call you in the middle of the night?
Some have. I would rather they didn't do that. But they email you in the middle of the night, or they text you in the middle of the night.
Do they expect you to respond at 3 o'clock in the morning?
I think some do. I try not to encourage that kind of behavior, but, But, the other part of it is when somebody, say I'm working with an actor, and they come off stage at 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night, that's when they're ready to deal with problems.
Sure.
That's when they're ready to deal with questions. So you can't resent it if that's when they think to call you because they want to respond to something you asked them earlier. You can try to put parameters on it, but sometimes that's when it's paramount for them to deal with it. That's when it's foremost in their minds. I've had producers that do the same thing where they sort of start their day at 11 o'clock at night after they've seen their show, and that I try not to encourage, although sometimes you have to respond.
That makes sense. I mean,
It does go, but it's never ending now. I mean, it just, there's no downtime.
So, okay, you're now working along with various people, and what would you say would be a big no-no in your world, aside from asking you to guarantee the New York Times? What in terms of working is something that is a major turnoff to you in terms of working with a producer or an entity?
Well, I mean, something that's important to me, and it's not the other way around. It's something that I feel strongly about, which is that I won't lie to people on behalf of a client.
Mm-hmm.
I might not give the press everything I know, or I might withhold some information. I'm not going to, tell them something terrible. But I'm also not going to lie, because at the end of the day, all I have to offer is my credibility. And so if someone comes to me and says, well, I'd like you to say X, Y, and Z, and I know it's a lie, I won't do it. And so there are times when I'll walk away from a project, or I won't get hired for a project because that's not what they need. And I understand that, but then they need to find somebody else.
Mm-hmm. So in other words, you have definitely worked with people who wanted you to tell a great big lie about something.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. And the fact is that I have to go back to these same journalists with the next project.
Sure.
And if I've lied to them, before, why should they even take my call or open my emails?
That makes sense.
I've just shot myself in the foot.
You're risking all of your major relationships.
Yeah, I mean, and I won't do that. So there's nothing to be gained by that, at least in my opinion. So I'm not trying to be noble or anything. I'm just saying that, all I've got is my credibility. Is if I'm a press agent and you're a journalist, and I call you up, I want you to take my call. I want you to read my pitch.
Sure, of course.
And if I've pissed you off in some way, or I've lied to you, or I've misled you about something, and then you have discovered it and been embarrassed in some way, why would you want to work with me on the next one?
Well, of course, that makes absolute sense. And I assume a huge part of your business is establishing and fostering relationships with the media.
Of course, when very early in my career, something happened which I thought it was brilliant on the part of this producer. I always ask people how they came to me. How did they hear about me? Did someone refer them to me? I'm always interested because, first of all, it's interesting, and second of all, I want to thank them if somebody, made a referral. And a producer came to me, and I said, "How did you hear about me?" And he said, "I called the editor of the Arts and Leisure section at the New York Times, and I said, would you give me the name of 3 press agents whose calls you will always take?" And he said, "You were on that short list of 3.
Wow.
And I never forgot that. First of all, I thought it was very clever of this producer. I thought, what an imaginative thing for him to do. And wasn't that nice that arts editor
I'd say so.
included me. But I always thought that was pretty clever.
I can definitely recall you're asking me that very question when I
Sure.
called you. How did I find
it's
you?
always interesting because you never know. You never know where people come from or how they. How did you find me?
I found you on the internet.
See that? Go figure.
I just searched on the internet for publicists in New York City.
Wow.
Public relations, publicity.
Yeah.
I was looking for searching all those things. That's how I found
Isn't
you.
that, see? And when I first was asked by a friend of mine, in fact, that friend that I mentioned who also corresponded with Mary Martin as a youngster, she was my webmaster. And when she came to me, I don't remember when, in the late 90s, I forget, and said, I'd like to create a website for you. And I said, "Oh, Fran, what do I need a website for? All my referrals come through people I've worked with or, former clients and stuff." And I really genuinely thought it was ridiculous and said, no one's ever going to find me on the internet. Shows what I know.
Well, there you go. People will definitely find you on the internet.
So thank you, Fran Weil. Yes.
So the flip question of the one I just asked you a minute ago, which is what are always great things to have producers or other entities ask of you? What is it that you wish they asked more of you?
That's a good question. I don't really know. I certainly appreciate it when somebody wants my creative input about a project. I've sat in lots of meetings where I've made lots of suggestions, and I've also sat in lots of creative meetings where it was very clear that no one was the least bit interested in my creative suggestions.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I once had a director say to me, not only did he not want to know what I thought, but he said, people get fired for offering up creative suggestions like that.
Ay, ay, ay.
And of course, the irony was that the musical turned out to be a big flop.
Well, of course.
But
that makes sense.
Well, not just because of me, but for many reasons.
No, but if that attitude was at the top, that was pervasive.
Yes, and actually, I think that was part of it because it was kind of ill-conceived, and it was, there were a lot of things wrong with it, but it did start from the top, and the fact that they were not interested at all in what anybody else thought. The huge stars and huge directors and huge producers are very interested in what people think. Bob Fosse, they didn't come any smarter than Bob Fosse, and the fact that he not only wanted to know what people thought, he went out of his way to find out what people thought.
I think that
extraordinary.
One of the things that I've learned over the years, and I've read a lot about it as well, is that the really top and best people in all fields of endeavor, it's not just in the theater, those top people are always looking to have people that are better than them in certain ways to help
Yes.
them look better as a leader.
Exactly.
And so that's
that is the sign of both creatively and just good leadership.
Yeah, I agree. That is a big deal to not think that they have to hold all of it on their shoulders at one time.
You know, I'll tell you, my very first big show was Applause, as you mentioned, with Lauren Bacall.
Yeah.
And when the show was out of town, everybody felt that the young actress that had been hired to play Eve Harrington, who was, you know, the nemesis, that was the challenge to Bacall's character, wasn't strong enough against Bacall, and that she was going to be replaced. And Betty felt terrible, but she actually insisted that she be there when this young actress was told, because she felt it would soften the blow if she were there, and it just wasn't done by the producers, which was very kind of her. But Bacall also knew that she would be better if the actress playing Eve Harrington was stronger.
Yeah.
So that it wasn't just about the Bacall character, but that there was a real struggle, and that if the other actress was stronger, it would make her better.
Oh, she probably also sensed in every performance that she was holding back.
I don't know, but I mean, she agreed that this young actress just wasn't seasoned enough.
Mm-hmm.
She wasn't strong enough to be playing opposite her. I mean, Bacall was a strong character on stage and off stage too, but she also knew that she would be better if her adversary on stage was better, and that was an interesting lesson, you know, to see it happen.
Yeah. So, okay, so would you say, is one of either you or someone else, what is the best attention-getting trick you've ever seen?
Oh goodness, that's really tough. Well, in my career, Zero Mostel dying was pretty much a showstopper.
Well, let's talk about that. That's a fun story.
In every way.
but that killed the show, not just Mostel.
Well, it did, but it didn't. I mean, it wasn't on purpose. Just, you know.
So tell us what happened.
Okay, so Zero Mostel was hired to play Shylock in this new play by Arnold Wesker called The Merchant, and it was the Arnold Wesker's telling of the Merchant of Venice story from the Jewish perspective. And everyone thought this was going to be this sort of intellectual show of the play of the year, the way Equus had been and other plays. And so it had really wonderful actors in it, Marion Seldes, and it had just you know, top-rated people. And Zero Mostel playing this very serious role that he really wanted to do because he very much identified with his Jewish heritage, and it was important to him. He lost 100 pounds in preparation for the play. He went on that liquid diet, which everyone later found out was not such a wonderful thing, but at the time it was very popular, and he did it under doctor's supervision. He passed the physical for the show's insurance, started rehearsals. We went to Philadelphia. He played one preview, got sick, went into the hospital, and subsequently died. That's the short version. The preview to all of this was that it was one of those productions, and I've never worked on anything quite as terrible as this production, where if it could go wrong, it did go wrong. So time after time after time, if something could be done the right way or something could get screwed up, it would get screwed up. Something as simple as everybody in the universe looked at the window card poster for the out-of-town dates and the New York dates, and after it was printed, they realized that the date that was printed didn't exist. So maybe it said Monday, November 5th, and maybe November 5th was a Tuesday. So it was just wrong. And everybody in the universe had looked at it, and everybody approved it, and it was wrong. So that was just one little thing that went wrong, but it was endless. So by the time we got to Philadelphia, tremendous infighting. The director was kind of cruel, not kind of, he was very cruel to the actors, and so the actors were always in tears. And so by the time, and the first preview, which I was at in Philadelphia, we all went down there. It was the first time they'd actually run the entire play straight through because they hadn't had time to fully rehearse it. The first preview was over 4 hours.
Oh.
Yeah. So it wasn't, this wasn't great either.
What'd they think they were doing, Shakespeare?
I don't know, go figure. But it went on and on and on. And you could see that it was maybe going to be good if they could cut it, but it was, people didn't quite remember their lines, including Mostel, and it was, it was possible, but it wasn't there. And then he went to the hospital, and then a week later he died. And the truth is, I was a young press agent, and I was very in the middle of all these kind of ongoing dramas and disasters, and and in some cases they were my fault because I hadn't caught the mistake, like the poster and things like, I was blamed for it, although everybody looked at it. And so in my mind, by the time he actually died, I wasn't all that surprised. Because it seemed like, the little black cloud was just over this show, and everything that could go wrong did go wrong.
It was the Murphy's Law of theater.
It really was,
Holy moly.
And the kicker to the whole thing was it should have just stopped. When he died, they should have just closed up and folded the tent and gone home. But the director, John Dexter, who was not a particularly nice human being, convinced the Schuberts, who were producers, that it had to go on, and it had to go on immediately, and that he would had all these big stars in his back pocket, like Laurence Olivier and Anthony Quinn, and he reeled off all these really famous actors that he supposedly was going to produce that would replace Zero Mostel. And it turned out he didn't have anybody in his back pocket, and he wound up giving the part to Zero's understudy, who was a perfectly fine character actor who had as much chance of replacing Zero Mostel as I did. It just was not possible. And so it opened in New York and it closed because it was, the Black Cloud won.
Well, that sounds like it was totally doomed from the start.
Well, if it had been cut, if it had been, if they had had time to really work on it and do it, and get the script into a workable length and people had learned their lines, who knows? Maybe it would have worked. But it didn't work. What they brought into New York didn't work. And the kicker was the last performance at the curtain call. I'm sure some of your listeners, and you certainly know what a fire curtain is.
Yes.
They don't show them anymore in theaters, but it's a very heavy curtain that's up in the flies, and it's only brought down occasionally for safety purposes. And the theory is that if there's a fire on stage, you only burn up the actors, you don't burn up the audience, or vice versa.
Or vice versa.
Anyway, there's a very heavy fire curtain that's above every stage, everywhere. And at the final curtain call for The Merchant, the last performance in New York, the last moments of the show, as the cast was taking their curtain calls, out of the corner of their eye, somebody noticed that the fire curtain had started to fall. And they were able to grab everybody and pull them upstage, and so the fire curtain fell, and didn't hit anybody. But it could have killed them all.
That's
if it
unbelievable.
Hit anybody. And one of the actors in the show said Zero had the last word.
No kidding.
Yep.
Because fire curtains don't come down, really.
No. So everything about it was, as I say, the black cloud was there till the final moment of the show.
That's eerie.
Isn't that creepy?
That's creepy. Yeah,
it's true, though. It's absolutely true.
That just does not happen,
No, it was very creepy.
Would you say that's the single biggest disaster you've ever been involved in?
It was. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I've been involved with other ones, but that was pretty daunting, and it was so horrible on every level. I mean, it had been so difficult all through rehearsals and out of town, and everything about it had been fraught. So the people that lived through it were all sort of bonded. When I was first writing my book, that actually was the first chapter I wrote because it was such a memorable experience that I wanted to get it all down on paper. And then I sent it to various people, including the production stage manager. And I said, would you look at this and see if I've forgotten anything, or if the facts are right, or if there's anything I've missed. And every single person I sent it to, called me up and said, oh my God, I never got over that one. It just left such scars because it was so difficult.
Well, for the listeners out there, it's a really wonderfully told chapter in the book. It's, definitely worth the price of admission just to read just that chapter.
It's pretty interesting. And interestingly, Arnold Wesker, who recently passed away, who was the playwright, was keeping a diary during this time, and which we didn't know, but, he was entitled to. And he subsequently wrote a book, and I can't remember the exact title, but it's something like The Birth of Shylock and the Death of Zero Mostel. and it's basically his chronicle from his point of view of what went on. And the interesting thing is that during the production, John Dexter insisted on cutting a lot of passages in the play without Arnold Wesker's approval. And they had been very close friends and colleagues and colleagues in the British theater. And he did this without the playwright's permission. And in this book, Arnold Wesker includes every single word that was cut from the play. Complete scenes, complete, this dialogue instead of that. Every word that was cut from the play is in that book.
That's a kind of power, isn't it?
He got the last word.
He got the last word.
Uh-huh.
Can you think of any disasters you were involved in which you pulled somebody's bacon out of the fire?
Ooh. I think I probably have in lots of small ways. I once sort of saved Mary Martin during a live radio interview, a national radio interview she was doing in conjunction with it was sort of her comeback after having been away from theater for about 10 years. And she was fine. Somebody in the audience asked a really stupid question because the play, it was a straight play. It was a comedy called Do You Turn Somersaults? And she didn't sing in the play. And this woman got up during this live broadcast from the Kennedy Center that I just happened to be at, and she said, well, I thought it was a jip that you didn't sing in this show. And Mary very interestingly explained that originally she did sing a song. She played an old vaudevillian character who is reminded of something she sang in her old act. And in the play, she starts to sing it, and then she's overcome with memories, and she can't go on, so she doesn't finish the song. And Mary said originally she did sing the whole song, but that people were applauding for Mary Martin, and it took them out of the play. And so the decision was made to have her character only sing half the song and then sort of become overcome with the memory of it and stop, which I thought was a really interesting explanation. And this woman said, well, I don't care. I thought it was a jip on national radio, live national radio. So the next question they took from the audience, I got up, and I hadn't seen her in over 10 years, Mary Martin at this point. I mean, she didn't know who I was. And I got up and I said, well, can I just say on behalf of audiences everywhere how thrilled we are that you're back on the stage, and we don't care whether you're singing or reading the phone book. We want you back on the stage. And she was she sort of blew me a kiss from the stage where she was doing this interview. And that was that. And afterwards, my friend at the Kennedy Center, who was the press agent, said, come say hello to Mary. And I said, she won't remember me. I was just some kid who used to write to her. And he said, come on. And he sort of dragged me over. And before I could say anything, she said, thank you so much. You really saved that very awkward moment. And I said, well, you won't remember me, but we used to be pen pals. My name is Susan Schulman. And she said, oh, my God, I know exactly who you are. And I said, well, I'm seeing the show tonight. And she said, well, come back afterwards and we'll talk. And we wound up sitting in a dressing room for like an hour talking as, kind of two people in the theater, except, of course, one that was really, really famous and one that wasn't. But the fact that I was given this really tiny opportunity to pay back and sort of help out somebody that had been so important to me and so good to me as a kid was such a gift.
Well, and
who gets a chance to do that? Really,
I was going to say it's very rare that people get that opportunity.
Really, never. And so to me, I mean, I was over the moon that in some little tiny way, I could pay it back. But anyway, that's sort of an example of what you asked.
I think it's a very good example. We would be remiss if we don't cover the bigger kahuna of of Broadway, and that is your experience with the late, great Mr. David Merrick. So give us a little taste of what you experienced in your working with David Merrick.
Well, let me preface this by saying that I grew up on David Merrick shows. I mean, as a kid, I saw, Hello, Dolly and Mame. And Mame, was Mame his? I'm not sure.
I don't know. That's a good question.
The Roar of the Grease Paint, Smell the Crowd. I mean, everything that David Merrick produced, I saw growing up. And so the first time I was told that David Merrick was going to come to my office was a big deal. I mean, now the fact was that by this point in his life, this was during State Fair in the mid-90s. By this time, David Merrick had a very, very major stroke, and he could neither walk nor talk. So everything he said came out as kind of gibberish, and then it was interpreted by his companion. And so you would ask him a question, and he would sort of mumble something, and then his companion would say, "Well, Mr. Medic feels," and then she would talk for 10 minutes. And you'd think to yourself, she got all that from blah? It was all very peculiar. Now, he was in there. You could see that he knew what was going on, and he was very opinionated some of the time, and others of the time there was nobody home. So it was a very peculiar experience because you knew that he knew more than everybody else in the room he knew more. He had forgotten more than everybody else in the room knew.
Yeah, for sure.
So on one hand, it was, oh my God, it's David Merrick. On the other hand, it's an impaired David Merrick.
Well, on the other hand, it was, oh my God, it's David Merrick.
Yeah, yes. So, I mean, it was a very bizarre experience. And part of the promotion, initially State Fair was produced by the Theater Guild and then had a lot of associate producers. And somewhere when we were out of town, it was never supposed to come to Broadway. It was always going to be this additional Rodgers and Hammerstein show that would be then licensed for community theater and summer stock and whatever. But people loved it out of town. They loved it on the tour. It got great reviews. And it slowly began to dawn on people that maybe they should bring it to New York. And as this thought was coming forward, David Merrick decided he wanted to buy the production and produce it himself. And after much discussion, he came in, he threw a lot of money at them, and it became David Merrick Presents the Theater Guild production of Rodgers and Hammerstein's State Fair. And that was what eventually came to Broadway and unfortunately didn't last too long. But it was very strange because, as I say, he was sort of there and he was sort of not there. There were other times where he'd sit in the meeting and he'd be asleep.
And so what did you do? I mean, this is a guy who's a legend. Did you treat him differently in some way?
No, I always treated him as if he was the legendary David Merrick, and he was the legendary David Merrick. It's just that it was in a very peculiar situation. I mean, he didn't really. I mean, there was a big big advertising campaign at one point, and it was called Memos from Merrick. These were New York Times ads, and they were very funny and clever and snarky, and they were supposed to be kind of a throwback to when David Merrick was in his heyday and would sort of stick pins into other shows and would take on people just for the hell of it, and and create events just to cause havoc and sell tickets. I mean, that was his thing, and he was really good at it. And so they created these ads that, truthfully, I don't think he ever saw. They were either written by the advertising agency or the other producers. There were a lot of people that had their fingers in them. I had a little involvement, not too much. And they were really fun, and they were clever, and they poked fun at other shows, and they were snarky, and they were kind of sarcastic. And it had this picture of David Merrick in his heyday with his big black fedora and his mustache, and he looked like the David Merrick everybody remembered. Of course, he didn't look like that then, but that was the image. And these ads got a lot of attention, and nobody ever questioned whether he was involved with it. It was very interesting. Nobody said, well, did he even know that these ads were in the paper? And the truth was, I don't think he did.
That's...
And nobody picked up on it. It was very... And so we maintained this kind of... I never actually said he wrote them, and nobody ever asked me if he did write them. So it was Memos from Merrick, and, people filled in the blanks.
Well, I find the whole thing very amusing,
And I kept waiting for someone to say, but, that guy over there in the wheelchair who can't speak, he wrote those? And nobody ever did.
Well, that will tell you the wattage of his reputation.
Yes, absolutely. And that's what everybody decided to, that's what the agency particularly was playing off of.
Absolutely.
And then the Tony nominations came out, and the producers decided that State Fair had been screwed a little bit by not getting a certain nomination. And so then they really got snarky about the ones that did get that. It was a best... I can't remember, best songs or something was the category. And because some of the songs were written for film, they disregarded those songs because there had been a film at State Fair. That was the reason. And some of them were taken from other shows, other Rodgers and Hammerstein shows. And so only some of the songs in State Fair were eligible. It was all pretty dopey. And so then we had a campaign saying, "Can you guess which songs are eligible?" in State Fair. I mean, we were clutching at straws, believe me. But they were all kind of dopey things that someone like David Merrick would have absolutely done.
Well, of course, that was he had a huge reputation, so people were working off of that.
And I think those were his ideas. Of course, some of them were terrible, like the terrible thing he did on the opening night of 42nd Street, which was that Gower Champion, who was the director, had died that day, and Merrick kept it a secret. And in those days, all the critics came to opening night. They didn't come to previews the way they do now. And he had the press agent call all the critics and all the journalists and say, at the end of the show, don't leave. Normally they all rushed up the aisle and went back to their newspapers to file their stories. And this press agent said, Mr. Merrick said it's worth your while to stay. So nobody knew what was going to happen, but they all thought, oh, David Merrick's got something up his sleeve. Let's see what's going to happen. And so they all stayed. And at the curtain call, David Merrick came out with the curtain still up and the cast still on stage. And none of the cast knew. And announced that Gower Champion had died that day. And, of course, the cast was just devastated. One of them was having an affair with him, it turned out. And the cast was just destroyed. And the horrible thing, and, of course, everybody, it made front pages of every newspaper in the country. But the horrible thing was that David Merrick knew that it made a better story if behind him there were all these grief-stricken actors weeping, because he could have brought the curtain down and then made his speech. But he chose to leave the curtain up and expose these actors, which I thought was horrible. But the way he thought was, or I assume the way he thought, was that it was a better picture. It
was publicity.
If right behind him was these weeping actors.
Of course.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, so we've been chatting here for a good hour and 5 minutes, and
oh my goodness,
we're coming toward the end of the show, and I want to encourage the listeners of this podcast to go out and get Susan's book, Backstage Pass to Broadway. You'll hear a lot more about David Merrick. There's much more to tell in that story, which we're not going to cover today. Some of it's like hair-raising. And also you can hear stories about Susan's experiences with Abbie Hoffman and with Raul Julia and Ray Bolger and George C. Scott, and certainly more about Mary Martin. And I love the story about Robert Redford and the art of disappearing in plain sight, and Mike Nichols and many, many more stories, including your longtime childhood friendship with the Fonz, Henry Winkler.
Right.
So, but the last question I'm going to ask you today is, do you have a particular piece of advice or a tip that you could give to someone who's either thinking about starting out in the business or already is in the business and looking for a way to make good?
Well, part of it is what we talked about earlier, which is you shouldn't be in the theater unless you can't stand not to be in the theater. But also it's to be open to things. I get kids that come to see me about, wanting to work, and they say, they've taken a PR course or PR degree, and they say, I only want to work on shows that begin with the letter P.
Wow.
It's very specific. It's very narrow perspective. And my whole career has been being in the right place at the right time and being prepared for whatever happened. So there was no plan. There was no specific chart. I was prepared, and I happened upon things that I was right for, and people appreciated it, and they got it, and they hired me. And then I went from there to the next thing. But I think part of it is being open to things and listening to what's going on around you, because the way you grow is you learn from people that are better than you. And I was lucky enough to work with some really terrific, smart people, both press agents and producers and directors and actors, and I learned from every single person.
Well, I think that is sound advice, not just for this business, but for any business.
Yes, I think it is, actually.
And so I want to thank you for saying that, because but a lot of people are closed-minded to things and need to be more open-minded about it.
Yeah, because you don't know how it's going to, what it's going to turn into. And sometimes it's not good. I mean, sometimes it's, you realize you made a mistake and you got to make a U-turn.
Mm-hmm.
But very often, even something that you were dubious about turns out to be interesting and creative and much more challenging than you thought, and you learn a lot, and then it leads you to something else, and you just don't know.
Well, I think that's fantastic thoughts for to close the show, and I want to say what a true treat and a delight it's been to have you on StoryBeat, and I'm so glad that you spent a little time with me today.
Well, thank you. As I say, we've worked together on lots of projects, and this to me was really it's unusual for me to be in the hot seat. So it's been fun and challenging, and you made it easy.
I hope you don't feel too cooked.
No, just a little cooked, not much. Underdone.
Very good. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Steve.
Have a great day.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye. And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a comment on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great episodes to you. This podcast would not have been possible without the generous support of the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.